Mhm.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining. And I know we've got a few folks online, so Ben, if you wouldn't mind just sort of monitoring the chat online, or anybody has their hands raised, and just let me know and we can jump onto those questions. Otherwise, welcome everyone. This is Project Advisory Committee number 3 for the Dallas TSP update. And I know it's been a little while since we've seen everybody here, so we want to just kind of bring everybody up to speed and where we're at today and sort of where we're headed. I've got, I won't call it a brief presentation. This is actually quite a lengthy presentation covering quite a bit of material. And so we'll try to keep it fairly high level. I believe Ben here, the CEO of Dallas, shared with folks a number of materials over the last week or so. One of the more recent things was a relatively short 2 to 3 page memo that kind of briefly summarizes everything we've been working on and ask folks a few questions. So I didn't want to pile on reading for everybody, but I was trying to think about this time and think about ways that you might want to look at that memo, look at the kinds of questions that we're asking, and just kind of guide your review process through that lens. We're going to try to sort of achieve the same thing with this presentation today. Really just want to like walk through what we've been sharing so far and try to get as much feedback as we can today, but we'll also be giving this time frame for getting us additional feedback following this meeting. So with that, let me go ahead and get started. Again, just in terms of our agenda today, we're going to be covering we're going to be providing a quick update. We're going to be covering 4 technical memos that have been from our future conditions analysis, which helps us to identify what gaps, deficiencies, needs there are in the future, what types of solutions that we developed to address those deficiencies. And the tech memo, I think these are actually slightly out of order. Tech memo 7 is the transportation standards memo, and tech memo number 8 is our funding and financing memo. So just the standards kind of gets into what standards would be applied to the work to help meet a lot of the same, address a lot of the same gaps, deficiencies, needs we're seeing in the future, and funding and financing, of course, is how they solve. So I do want to try to preserve some time at the end for general discussion, but we also have breakpoints between each of these major topics. Please just jump in with questions along the way. If folks online, please use any one of the functions there, the raise hand function, the chat function, just keep us up to speed. I may call on people just in case, just to keep the conversation going and light. So also to make sure no one's falling asleep on us. All right. So for in terms of a project update to the timeline, we got started back in July of 2024, and as you sort of fast forward through time, between March and today, we've largely been focused on the future conditions analysis and developing some of the solutions. Our original vision was to get together with you guys several months ago, present the future conditions analysis, but we hit a few speed bumps in developing our travel demand model, and so in the process of getting the model fully calibrated and approved by ODOT, and so that it produced results that made sense to us and others, we just sort of that timeline just kept on building. And so here we are in November, and looking at some of this additional material just to kind of keep us on the same track, which is a goal of getting to adoption sometime in spring, summer of 2026. So again, here we are in this November 2025 timeframe with the future conditions, solutions, standards, and policies in place. Right in line with that, we have a series of technical memos. You guys have reviewed tech memos 1 through 4. Those memos going backwards, if you looked at sort of all the background documents, all the plans and policies and development codes that inform how we do planning here in Dallas. We developed this community transportation framework, which is largely the goals and objectives of updating the TSP, also serves as a basis for developing policy in the future. We then developed a couple of different memos. One on how we were going to approach evaluating existing and future conditions analysis. That's our analysis methodology memo. And then we went forward with our inventory of existing conditions. So that was also when we had our last check-in, whenever we met with you guys last time, was to talk about the inventory of existing conditions analysis. We also had an open house right on the heels of that meeting and collected quite a bit of feedback both online and in person for trying to fully understand what the gaps, deficiencies, needs are in the existing conditions. So again, looking ahead, what we have in draft format right now are a series of tech memos. The first of those is future conditions, and we move through all of the solutions and standards and things. The next set of memos, there's only one more memo before we get to the, actually probably two more memos before we get to the TSP. Next memos will cover a lot of the policies that sort of serve as a basis for how we implement the TSP in the future. Implementing ordinances, this kind of largely gets to a lot of codes that get updated to the extent that they need to be updated, and then the TSP itself. So just a few more steps here before we get closer to a draft. So for meetings, this makes it look like we haven't progressed very much, but you'll see as we get into 2026, we'll have we're envisioning our open house to be sometime in the early part of January, and then somewhere on the heels of that, we'll be meeting with the planning commission to do one of our first work sessions, like a work session, where we kind of get into the weeds on some of the potential solutions and projects and things. We'll have our next PAC meeting number 4 sometime in March, and we have a projected date that I'm trying to help us to stick to. We'll share that in the presentation. We have more work sessions, and then by May and June, we'll be looking going through the process. So that is kind of a little bit of background, a little bit of like what we've been doing, and a little bit on the schedule. So maybe real quick before I jump into our first major topic, which is future conditions. Any quick questions on kind of background stuff? Anybody online? Anything? No? All right. I'm gonna keep going. So for the future conditions analysis, as I kind of alluded to there, this we start with our existing inventory and our existing conditions analysis, and we look into the future and we try to understand what are the gaps, what are the deficiencies, what are the needs to really accommodate growth in the future. So it mimics to a large extent our existing conditions analysis. Looks at the same things like intersection operations, pedestrian and bicycle levels of traffic stress, and other measures that can determine what those future needs might be. But we do start by start this one. So just a quick overview of the memo. This memo is relatively short, but there's a lot of material there. First thing we look at is population and employment forecasts. This is, and I'll get into this in more detail here in a couple of seconds, but this is essentially what forms the foundation for growth that we evaluate in the city. We look at the different planned improvements that are identified at both the state and local level. We get into that motor vehicle and non-automobile type of analyses, again, that reflect largely what we look at under existing conditions. So the population forecast, again, kind of the first step in jumping out to the future, is based on a variety of things. First and foremost is the Portland State University Population Research Center. They develop forecasts for all counties and the urban growth boundaries of incorporated cities throughout the state, and we are required to use that as a basis for all of our population forecasts. We use that to understand what that population forecasts look like. We then look at Polk County assessor data, US Census data, and combination with comprehensive plan and zoning map information to then take that population and distribute it throughout the city in places where we would anticipate some growth to to be okay. You can kind of see in the map on the top right corner of this slide here where some of the concentrations of future population could exist. And we look at both population and household. And you can kind of pick up on some of this. There are a few key nodes that exist within the city. You have the Barbary node, you have the Lockreal node, the Wyatt node, and we have a number of other places where there is a fairly significant amount of development capacity for future residential uses. And so with all this, all these data sources and all this information, we do our best to kind of distribute this population and use that again as a foundation for what kind of growth is occurring for households and population. We take a very similar approach for employment, where we use Oregon Employment Department's quarterly census of employment and wages, QCEW, and along with Polk County Assessor, the U.S. Census and Comp Plan zoning map to both identify the amount of growth and employment in Dallas and where that employment is expected to occur. So again, you can see there's quite a bit of employment growth up there in Rockville, area, as well as down there, kind of like the industrial area south of Miller, just so you can see also the table and point this out to our population side. The table down below shows you what that growth is expected to be. So between 2025 and 2045, we're looking at about almost 2,000 additional jobs, or about a 30% growth in employment in the city. I'm going to bounce back up just real quick to kind of highlight the same thing. So in terms of population, 2025 to 2045, we grow by about 5,800 households. We grow about 2,260. That's like roughly a 30% increase in the population household. This, I'll just mention for a moment, this information really forms the foundation for how we determine what growth is going to occur within the city and where that growth is going to occur. You may have said that same thing twice. How much growth is going to occur and where it's going to occur. And it's really critical for us to understand what those future conditions looks like. Any quick questions on future population and employment?
I just mentioned that the FMO 5 that FMO is still in graph form, so we're turning graphs on it. And there's a little smoothing that needs to happen, I believe, based on the comments that I read. And these comments, the more substantive comments related to this work come from the Region 2 Traffic Unit and our Transportation Planning Analysis Unit at ODOT. I'm Mark Bernardo, so these are the plan.
Hey, Mark, would it be all right just to speak a little bit closer to the microphone? Just want to make sure I'm getting you picked up. Thank you.
So basically, the statement is that this FMO number 5 interior looking at now, it's in draft form. There are any comments that still need some work. So just keep in mind that it's a living document and will evolve.
Absolutely, thank you, Mark. And I should have mentioned that right up front, is that all of these amendments are in draft form. We're collecting as much feedback as we can, and they will remain in draft format until we get beyond our open house in January and can button things up then. There are also, as Mark alluded to, there are some else. We've already received some feedback from the city, from ODOT, from traffic engineering and TPAL. And some of those comments are pretty beefy comments that we're going to need to address, and we'll open to capture as much as we can before we all start kind of addressing this. Quick question.
Yeah, on the population growth map, I'm noticing in the downtown core, it looks like it's slated for 0 to 5,000 units. Am I reading those colors correctly?
It looks like it's, I might be mistaken, but it does, yeah, it looks like it is in that 0 to 5. And some of that does have to do with what it's a combination. One is what is the development capacity of something I didn't mention, is the transportation analysis zones that represent all the different spaces within this community. And I can get in detail on that if you like. And in comparison to the capacity of other nodes, like these three key nodes, the Lockville, the Wyatt, and Barbary. And so if there is not a significant amount of capacity within one area versus another, then it doesn't give as much of that population. It's just it's a very, we call it very proportionally distributed set of growth. Coupled with that, and this is something that's important to get kind of feedback on this, is if you are aware of an existing development application of a pending development, something that would kind of influence how we would start with that distribution, we can pinpoint where that's at, then that's the kind of feedback that we would need to understand how we might reallocate that. And so something like that, like there is a 50 unit development going right here, that transportation analysis zone would get those 50 units, and the rest would sort of be reduced by 50 proportion.
Gotcha, okay. Because when I'm looking at that, I am aware of applications, I don't think they're much further than that stage yet, of 2 developments in the downtown core. Looking at probably 40, 50 units each, but given that explanation, I'm not sure how to apply for all that, so. Thank you. I didn't know.
Basically, it's us here.
Well, I can certainly provide information on those applications, but I think part of it comes down to predictability. It's a lot harder to predict redevelopment and how many units might be in a redevelopment than it is to look at greenfield development and be like, hey, there's X many acres, we can expect X many units per acre. So yeah, and certainly we can update these figures to have the 2 development applications in front of us, but that doesn't mean that we're not gonna get another one, next month, or we may see no further redevelopment for the next 20 years. It's very difficult to predict that, so it's good.
That's a great point, Chase, and something I should have highlighted is this is largely based on what is, when I say developable, I mean greenfield, I don't mean redeveloped. There is some consideration to properties that are significantly underdeveloped, but there would need to be some pretty significant difference between improved versus unimproved value, fortunately. Yeah. But definitely want to hear about those developments to see if we can get it pulled together. One other thing I'll mention, and this is an important thing about too, is that as that development occurs, the city does have, as you all know, traffic impact analysis requirements that would hopefully capture any additional applications that would be great. Otherwise, I'm going to get impacts analysis. So that's the. Ben, for anything real no. Okay. So we take this population employment information and we roll it up into an analysis methodology that ODOT has coined as the enhanced zonal cumulative analysis method. And it's essentially like creating a travel demand model for the city. And so we take those transportation analysis zones that I mentioned, we take the population and employment growth, we plug it into a travel demand model, and it spits out what it expects volumes on the roadway system to look like. It does go through a calibration process, and if anybody wants to get into the appendix, contact on the file that kind of gets into that some detail. It's also subject to change pending some of the redistribution of population, employment, and some of the input we received from ODOT already. But essentially, this is what it produces. It produces a map that highlights what the anticipated traffic volumes are on the corridors, how those volumes might change relative to where they are today, and we use that as a basis for evaluating intersection operations, segment operations, and things like that. So actually, I think I got one more kick up. So kind of shifting into the analysis itself, the first thing we look at is planned improvements. And I mentioned this before, we look at the both statewide transportation improvement program. This is ODOT's sort of rolling program for improvements in the state highway system. And then Dallas's capital improvement plan. Before I go too deep into the weeds on this, I'll just say that despite the projects that were identified in these plans, we do anticipate both of these plans to be updated, or considerations for updating these plans will come out of the TSV update. So if we identify additional gaps, deficiencies, or needs on the state or the local system that don't necessarily align with what's in these plans, we could very well update. And I know Mark and others provided a lot of feedback on what projects are shown there, and all good considerations for potential updates to either the STIP or the CIP going forward. There is a couple other things I would want to highlight in there is that the city currently has a sidewalk replacement program, an ADA ramp program, a program that's targeted towards minor safety issues and equipment needs, as well as pavement overlays. So a lot of it, like foundational information, typically like to see in a capital improvement plan is already present in the city's plan, and essentially helps us start to identify what types of programs are in place to address some of those needs in the future. One more thing I'll highlight about this is that we essentially didn't include any of the projects identified in STIP or the CIP in our future conditions analysis. We did that for a couple of reasons. The main reason is that we don't want to inadvertently hide any of the issues that we're identifying as we go through our analysis. And again, if we want to update the plan subsequent to the TSP, we can do that. We also sometimes, in some instances, the funding may not be as secure as it seems. There may be some other priorities that come up in the next few years that sort of circumvent this process. And so we just want to be as conservative as we can as we're identifying those. That being said, they're just going to highlight here that one of our intersections, the West Ellendale Avenue 11th Street intersection, there is a new traffic signal that's in the very early stages, like just like, correct me if I'm wrong on this one, of design, potentially construction, and that's one of the ones that will otherwise be influence what the list of deficiencies are going forward.
Okay, good stuff.
Mark, you had a lot to say on those plans. Anything you want to add to that?
I mean, not particularly at this moment, only kind of, keeping in mind that like memo number 5, the tool and the analysis tool that we're using feeds into some of the assumptions of the subsequent tech memos, so tech memos 6, 7, and 8. For instance, if the tool shows that you need an increase in capacity in a road segment, then you can justify, going to a different typical cross section for that road segment. You'll see later in the presentation, there's actually a major arterial cross section that's in, I believe, the Dallas ordinance, land use ordinance. It's described there, and there is a diagram of that cross section in tech memo number 8 that's 100 feet wide, and the road segments that typical cross section is assigned to in the TSP and the draft memos. That that right of way currently stands at 60 feet, so you have to, in a sense, acquire another 67% right of way to get it to standard. And then East Ellendale is one of the roads that up to it is Villa, or is it Rockwell, where the diagram for the functional classification is a major arterial. So you have some pretty some pretty big challenges to get to that standing.
Yeah, Mark, jumping ahead just a tad bit, but
Just to give you a flavor.
yeah, no, that's an important topic. And one that I wanna spend a little bit of time on here too, because I think it's one of those topics that really start shaping the outcome of the plan. And so I think it's important to. All right, I'm gonna turn it to Erica to talk about intersection operations.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so this is not like a map that you've seen before in our last tech memos, specifically when we're talking about existing conditions. In this situation, though, it's a very similar process, but we are taking those future volumes, that Matt has kind of talked about how we got those and the groundwork leading up to that. So, in the future, 2045, currently, based off that analysis, we're seeing that 3 intersections will probably be exceeding their mobility targets that are currently set. One of those is Levens and Ellendale, and as Matt also brought up, that there is a possibly a traffic signal that will be going into that location, which should be helpful in that case. And then also we have Ellendale and Kings Valley Highway that is set to exceed its mobility targets at ODOT. And we also have a location at Fort Villa that should be exceeding its mobility target as well. Which is also one of those intersections that is currently being considered for possibly some changes. And there's 2 other locations that are not currently, based off our analysis, exceeding their mobility targets, but are getting pretty close, so you could see some congestion in those locations. And then we have 3 locations here, which you can see a little bit on this map, but there's just a few intersections that, while weren't analyzed, like Miller Avenue and La Creole, it's a specific location where there is there are other concerns, so we wanted to highlight those in this memo, specifically because it might be a concern the city has. And yeah, so we did some queuing analysis, kind of looking at how far back those queues might extend, and that is also in that memo. So all of this should be in there. And then we get started on more of the multimodal piece of this memo. This is a similar map to what you've seen before as well. As we looked at this, there's no current plans to update any of these routes, Chariots routes that are going through Dallas, but obviously some of the discussions on that is going to be in memo 6. So go ahead. Do you have anything else to add?
The only thing that I would add on that one is that we heard from Chariots during our last meeting and during the open house that while their current transit development plan doesn't include changes to the city's services, that they would continue to reevaluate that as population and employment grows. And so they could be looking at additional frequencies, additional services, and potentially something that I know we heard from a lot of folks during the open house in particular, interesting a little bit circuit, something that just kind of gets people around in Dallas proper. So while this analysis reflects what is basically on the books today, it could look very different in the future. So just wanted to acknowledge that.
Slide. And then the next part of this, once again, we saw this in existing conditions, this pedestrian level traffic stress. As a reminder, PLTS 1 is going to be the lowest possible stress street that you can find, and that's highly comfortable, easy to navigate for all ages. And often you'll see a lot of separation from the roadway. And then PLTS 4 will be the high stress environments that's very uncomfortable or sometimes even impossible to navigate. And so a lot of those locations you'll see if there's no sidewalks, it'll be a PLTS 4. The map will look a little bit different than last time because we did add trails to this map as well, because those are important connections to the city. And we also ended up doing some analysis for all of these that you're seeing are segment PLTS analyses, but then we did add the intersection of Ellendale and Kings Valley because we found that while we were finding it to be mostly for the bike section, we were finding that the PLTS was a little lower than we expected. Our PLTS a little lower than we expected. there's kind of some added challenges to navigating that, in the actual intersection, so we did have that, but. For this map, when we do PLTS, there isn't really a volume component, so when we talk about those, since usually those pedestrians are gonna be separated from the roadway. So this stays the same, also, we do know that there is the Dallas, program to go through and maybe add some of these sidewalks, but since that's. Through the entire, city, we didn't specifically, update certain locations here to reflect that. We go ahead to next. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask.
So question on the pedestrian level of traffic
Yes.
stress. So obviously the presence of sidewalk
Mhm.
contributes to that. Does the presence of a landscape strip between the
Yes.
curb and the sidewalk impact that?
Yes, so it'd be like added separation,
Okay.
which definitely does add.
And does that then tie back into like proposed street cross sections and policy as a way to improve level of stress by having landscape strips?
Yes, it definitely does, but what Erica's kind of alluding to is that just about any separation helps with LTS, so if you have. Even if you have curb type sidewalks, if you have like adjacent parking, then we would count adjacent, as long as it's occupied. We would have consideration to that 7 to 8 strip of parking as separation, similar with a bike, so if you have a bike lane there. Contributes to that separation. So if you had a combination, if you had a bike lane, parking lane, landscape strip, we're good 15 feet away from the adjacent travel lane, usually it's pretty comfortable to say that.
Because the reason I ask is that our current standards don't really specify whether the sidewalk is against the curb or behind the landscape strip, and so there's been some discussion about establishing a standard. And so looking kind of maybe at the TSP and as providing guidance as to which that standard should be. So that's why I asked.
Thank you so much.
Quick question, for pedestrian level of stress and stress, I didn't see, can you back up to the last pedestrian one? I'm interested in, how, Lancaster and Lockerall are treated, because Lancaster's supposed to extend down, but they need a piece of Academy. And then Lockerall extends to Miller. Is that interesting? So is there a potential bike and pedestrian movement along those connections, or
So when you say Lancaster, are you meaning Barberry? For Villa? Lancaster isn't Salem.
oh, I'm sorry, Hawthorne.
Hawthorne, okay.
We're all scratching our head. So, yeah, it's not connected now. I think there's a plan to connect it, so that would be one potential one, but the more important one would be is long. So, destinations that we could reach. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if I understand your question is, will these future roadway extensions? Is your question whether or not LTS will have an influence on what those future extensions look like?
I'm just wondering if we should be showing some level of stress on the road connection that Lockwood exists now.
Oh,
But it's not showing that. That's what I'm looking at. I don't know if the sidewalks there now or what's going.
Are you talking about south of Academy on Lockville?
Yeah.
There's currently a shared use path on the west side. Chase, I'm sure can correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm not sure if we had it on the map originally. I could double check on that. But there should be sidewalks on each side and then there is a shared use path on the other side. So it might have been a data. I don't know if we put that for it.
yeah, there was going back to our existing conditions analysis where we initially looked at level of traffic stress. It was more or less what we have was based on the data that we had available between a combination of the pedestrian and bicycle systems. And I think we did we did beef it up based on some feedback, and so this is the kind of feedback where like, if you would like to see the LTS results along these additional roadways, then. We just need to add it, so we'd be
Yeah.
happy to add that.
It might be helpful, because I mean, there's a bus connection on that facility, and it just makes sense that we would have the connection on the bus. Shown. And that one.
Yeah, I will keep that in mind, for sure. Okay. ELTS. Oh, we skipped the LTS, we go back one. Yeah, all good. So just wanted to go over this, because we actually do have some one or two changes on this one. So, the LTS is one of those analyses where the future volumes will affect the findings of bicycle and wheelchair traffic express. This is mostly because in those shared facilities where you have bicyclists who are riding with vehicles, if there are more vehicles, obviously it's going to be a bit more stressful for those bicyclists to ride. And as a reminder, the LTS one is very low stress. You might be able to ride this with a child. And the LTS 4 is very high stress, definitely in a shared facility with quite a few vehicles as well. So the only location where we found that it kind of went above the threshold was James Howe Road, because it is currently a shared, but it seems like in the future it'll probably be slated to have a facility on the west side. But also want to bring up the fact that just because technically the analysis due to the volumes going up doesn't change the VLTS. In the memo, we do have some notes about it will still be slightly more stress for a bicycle to ride those facilities. So it's just always important to note that. And then one other change you're going to see in this is the intersection VLTS that we added for Allendale and Kings Valley, which I think tells about a story of going up into that intersection. Those facilities might be a little bit better, but once you're in it, it could be a bit more stressful for bicyclists. So any questions on that one?
But that intersection shown a little stretch of the bicycle.
No, sorry, that is an error. That should be so VLTS 4 is the highest actually, sorry.
Agreed.
No, so so that's why we added it. So if you look at segment analysis of BLTS, it was showing that it was a little bit lower because they have separated facilities. But once you're actually in that intersection, let's say you're a bicyclist and you're trying to go through the intersection, take a lap somewhere, once people actually have to cross those lanes, that's a bit more stressful. Actually, I think we can do that.
Yeah, so like in the westbound direction, if you're on East Allendale and you're getting ready to head south into downtown. You have to essentially go from the bike lane across a through lane and into a dual left turn. You could also, cross the street, use the signal, which hopefully most people do. But that is an example of a high stress type of similarly, same approach, the westbound approach, where you have, and this, I think it's even worse than the northbound approach, where there is a separated bike facility, it's there, but when the right turn crosses over the bike lane, there's that long complex driving, and then the bicyclist is essentially exposed to vehicular traffic on both sides for, I think on the northbound approach, it's well over 275-ish feet, and the westbound approach, it's right around 150 or so. And so, again, fairly high stress type of environment. It's a little bit, like, ironically, it's a little bit better on the west or probably eastbound and southbound, just because of the configuration of the approach. But when we're doing LTS, we usually show the most critical analysis result. In other words, that would be a high stress intersection to try to cross.
Question, does bicycle level of traffic stress for off-street paths, does that take into account the width of the path and the number of users? Or is that just a flat number? I ask because there's a fairly wide discrepancy between like the paths we have in City Park, which are 4 or 5 feet wide, versus in Roger Jordan Park, where the paths are 10 feet wide. That's kind of a sizable difference in terms of being able to ride a bike, so wasn't sure if that's something that's captured in the metric, or if it's just a one size fits all kind of.
I think the way that we approached it in this case was more of a one size fits all, but there is some, whenever you're doing a more detailed off street type of an analysis, there are variations in the LTS. It is exactly the way you're describing it. It's a consideration to the width of the facility, the volume of the facility, and as well as the pavement surface or the surface, unimproved versus improved. So if there's we'd have to look and see what data is available for that. It's even harder to pick up on the aerial than sidewalk and bike lane data, but we can take a look at what data is available and try to add in some nuances there.
I'll see what I can send you.
Okay, go ahead to the next slide, unless there's any questions online. Okay, and then just as you're going through and looking through these memos, Matt did go ahead and I think we sent forth the kind of review of the memos and then some questions in a memo, but just in general, if you're looking through this, just give us an idea of, you know, these current findings, if they align with your understanding of the issues that you see happening in Dallas when it comes to transportation. And then also if there's additional gaps and deficiencies or anything else that we should be considering. So a lot of these conversations about how we're showing the LTS, very important because it kind of gives us an idea of like actually in your community, kind of how this analysis applies to real. So
Yeah, we can't emphasize this enough to, like, we look at a handful of intersections, we have a close look at it, as many roadways as we can. Other than that, we really rely on the agencies and advisory committees and the public to kind of guide us towards where the community feels like the most critical issues are, both today as well as in the future. So as much feedback as we can get on that, the better the outcome. So we're going to get into transportation solutions. This is so this memo was shared with the advisory committee, but is probably more on the preliminary than draft. And in the sense that we need to get our project management team together, make sure that everybody's on the same page with what's being presented in here, and then share it back with this group. So we'll follow the folks more on technical number 6 after this memo, or after this. But this is the package of what we're trying to present here. Is we're trying to present a range of potential solutions for addressing all the gaps, deficiencies, and needs that we identified both under existing and future conditions. It covers a lot of ground, and it's probably one of the longer of the bunch of memos here. We talk about the street connections, both roadway treatments, intersection treatments. Talk about bike and pedestrian and transit facilities, the off-street facilities, rail, and some safety stuff as well. So again, it covers a lot of ground. We're going to try to walk through stuff here at a fairly high level. Just up front, I think some of the feedback we're getting, or we would like to get from this memo, is: are there other treatments that we should be considering? Are there like, when we're considering this broad range of potential treatments, what other treatments should we be including in this? And to the extent that you can start telling us where you might like to see some of these things. So if nothing we're presenting is shown quite where you want to see it, we'd like to hear that. We'd like to hear that as well. And I think we have a few more guiding questions as we go. So the first one here, these are street connections and looking specifically at different roadway treatments. We just have the 3 here that we list and that we describe in the memo. The first one is complete streets. We don't actually have a lot of complete streets projects being presented in the solutions because the combination of street projects, bike lane projects, and sidewalk projects are all kind of dispersed into roadway, bike, and pedestrian kind of subjects or modes. But these could potentially be packaged up together and shown as like a complete street type of project. Oftentimes when the jurisdiction updates a roadway, does an urban upgrade on a roadway, that's exactly how we do it, we'll just make it consistent with the standard. Widening can be very similar, where like maybe what you're doing is you're bringing a roadway up to standard. You could be adding a center two-way left turn lane, you could be providing additional left or right turn lane. So there's a variety of things there. A lot of those widening treatments are handled elsewhere. So the new roadway extensions is really the large focus of what we've presented so far. A lot of these roadway extensions you have seen in the previous TSP. As you're looking in the memo, you'll see that we tried to flag all the issues that have been identified both in the previous TSP and through recent rounds of discussions about the street connections. But essentially they're all reflected here. Maybe just a couple of the ones I'll highlight for you. I know that I'm hoping they're going to stand out a little bit more on these screens. So we've got a couple of the ones I'll highlight for you. We have this connection here. This is a continuation of Fur Villa. It kind of comes down, tries to stay within the UGB and connects down here to Monmouth Cutoff Road. One of the things that we're seeing whenever we analyze this connection is it's starting to offload Miller, starting to offload Gutsy, offloading Monmouth Cutoff a little bit, because you can imagine if you're coming down here, you're sort of zigzagging away back. Similar if you're kind of trying to do the same thing in the opposite direction. So we do see a fair amount of volume on this roadway. Do see a fair amount of volume on this connection if and when we go through. Some of the other ones, obviously, like Lockreal, as the Lockreal node develops, this one also becomes a fairly significant connection up through here. Continues Lockreal north of Allendale, ties back into that Kings Valley. Another important one, I know this one is there's been a lot of discussion on both this connection as well as what it looks like when you get to East Ellendale. This is the continuation of Barbary up to East Ellendale. Some of the other ones folks are probably already familiar with and continuing this connection. Some of the ones up here in the Wyatt node and so on and so forth. So there's also this little guy right here, this very little innocuous connection, so a bridge connection, continuation. I think that's Riverdale. These are a little blurry here. This one actually ends up really pulling a lot of traffic off of West Ellendale, a lot of traffic off of Levens and off of Kings Valley. You can imagine folks who are coming in from the west can come right down here, cross the river, and get right into downtown. In fact, this one, based on our model, I think the folks on River Drive would be shocked to see how much traffic this is drawing down and across the river here. Question over there.
Yeah, in the Millside redevelopment plan, there's a proposed major road. I don't know what category it would be that comes off. So on Southeast Monmouth Cutoff Road, before it hits Uglow, it would go south along kind of the urban growth boundary line, and then connect up with that new road. It will then extend down to Bridlewood. It's been part of the plan that it's not been finalized, but that is kind of a major piece of that site that I don't see here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up, and that was one of the, we did receive that from ODOT as well, and a recent copy of the Millside redevelopment plan, so we're getting that folded in there. I think the folks, there's some other, in addition, there's some intersection treatments, there's some local street connectivity, there's some other things that they're all proposing that will all get folded into the TSP as well. We'll need that, we'll need to bring that connection in to understand into our model to understand what the volume is there. And then we'll also be making sure that cleans up with what they're doing in most site redevelopment. Let's say something.
Just further context on the Lockreal extension up to North Kings Valley. It's been shared in the project management team context that ODOT purchased access control along North Kings Valley Avenue, and that road was built in the 50s. So properties that abut that road on either side have a deed restriction that controls access. So that's one process that we need to, approach to making a road connection. It's basically a real estate sort of a deal in a sense. But yeah, there's a permitting process that to facilitate that connection. But this process. And then I thought I noticed on this diagram that land capture open Hawthorne. It doesn't extend all the way down to Academy.
Yeah, I think that was in our model, and that was something that if you see where Hawthorne, I believe this is Hawthorne right here. That
Yeah, I think that is it might be the one on the right of that short segment along Ankle that is, it actually is in the middle of it, I'm sorry, of that connection.
No, that you're absolutely correct, Mark, that that little short segment of Hawthorne needs to be extended further to the south. And we need, that's another piece of the model that needs to get updated. Otherwise, it's also missing from this map too.
Right. I mention it because that's an unannexed area of the UGB, and they're pretty on it when it comes to what's going on in that neighborhood. I know from experience being a full county owner, but they seem very aware of things, and it would be good to be intentional about advertising that connection.
So, as far as Hawthorne goes, I will share that, as part of our sewer extension down Hawthorne, we entered into an agreement with Polk County to take over, road jurisdiction. So, the city now has maintenance authority over Hawthorne. And we are getting ready, with the new year, to kick off, an attempt to annex the right of way. So that we will actually have the authority to go with that jurisdictional transfer. So we are looking to annex the roadway itself, not necessarily the properties along it, but the roadway would be in the city limits in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I'm just, they're all, I think, 1 acre parcels up there. Yeah, they've got land, so there's.
And there's some right of way acquisition that would have to happen to make everything kind of line up. So it's a little bit messy. It's kind of piecemeal how we're doing it, but as long as we get the job done in the end.
So this is a good, this example of how hard it is to reimagine or, urban landscape. And make these connections after, post, initial development. And that really is relevant to East Elm. Because the built environment is so challenging on there. It really conspires to kind of make improvements that facility challenging. And in some cases, limiting the opportunities to do so because it requires so much right of way acquisition. And the property owners, a lot of them, as far as I know, have been there for a long time. They're a long time.
Well, I will say one of the things that can help spur that kind of change is increase in zoning allowances. So going from having a 1 acre parcel with a house to having a 1 acre parcel with 40 houses. At that point, knocking down the existing one is kind of an attractive option because you can rebuild a whole lot more than is there currently. So to the extent that we can offer, those kind of incremental development options, that can help spur those kinds of changes.
I don't know if folks online can see our street here, but I'm just highlighting where that current street stubs. So some jurisdictions, they will include a sign right on the backside of the barrier that says this road will extend in the future. And I don't know what it takes to get a sign like that put in or what kind of controversy that will bring about, but that's one way that we communicated things like that last.
I won't make comment when there's microphones.
That's right. So I'm gonna continue on here to intersection treatment. So Erica just talked about a number of the intersection operational issues that we're anticipating under that 2045 timeframe. There's a lot on this slide and there's a lot in the memo that kind of gets into the weeds on these intersection treatments. One thing I'll just kind of think about this for the future when you see the memo is that there are a handful of intersections that are identified that are more or less carrying solutions that were identified in current TSP. So there's some needs for some signal upgrades, some new traffic signals, some other intersection configuration changes. There's also information in Dallas State Routes to School Plan that talks about different upgrades to signals. Things like something we call leading pedestrian interval, which is a way of getting the folks out and ahead of the signal change, and a variety of other different treatments. The one that I'll highlight real quickly here, and I'll leave the rest of you guys to review, is the Kings Valley and Allendale Avenue intersection, as Erica mentioned, is problematic. We're exceeding the standard in 2025 condition. We don't know that we're going to be able to build our way out of that operation mission. We already, as mentioned before, we already have dual left turn lanes at the westbound approach, separate left turn lanes at every approach, separate right turn lanes, channelized right turn lanes. It's already a fairly significant intersection. And we also talked about how it's stressful for people walking and biking. So we're not shying away from any kind of operational enhancements, but we're also looking at different ways we can address it. One of the ways that I just want to reiterate here is some of the additional street connections that we're talking about just a couple of slides ago, where we're looking at extending Lock Reel to the north, kind of providing additional connectivity within that Lock Reel area in general. Some of the additional connections further to the west along River Drive and elsewhere, all that additional street connectivity serves to essentially offload segments of east and west Ellendale, bring traffic around that area or circumvent that area, and essentially bring down the intersection, the traffic lines entering that intersection. It's not going to solve all the problems, especially 20 years in the future, but it's one way that we can deal with operational issues. Another thing I'll flag real quick is that we'll also be looking at things like alternative mobility standards or targets. Right now, the mobility target is established by Oregon Department of Transportation through the Oregon Highway Plan, and that same plan lays out a process for which you can start to look at alternative mobility targets. So right now, I think the target is 0.95, and which means that you'll accept about 95% of the potential capacity at the intersection. You can use that before it's exceeding the target. We can bump that up to 1, which is not a small amount of additional traffic, and we can extend that condition beyond the peak hour during the evening. We can extend it to the second, third, I think up to the 5th peak hour. I've seen some jurisdictions. I just saw one the other day that has it to the peak hour. I've never seen it before to the coast. But anyway, there are ways to kind of get around that so that it doesn't become a barrier to development and growth of the city. But if you're thinking about alternative mobility targets, you're also thinking about accepting higher level of congestion through section. So there are some trade-offs there. Again, there's a lot of other different things that we're considering at a lot of different locations. So I just encourage you to take a look at those and let us know if you have additional thoughts.
I'll just chime in that the West Valley Hospital has been considering a somewhat major expansion of their current campus that would involve pretty significant reconfiguration of the site access to the hospital. So nothing really to be captured in the TSP because we don't know for sure what that's going to look like when it's done. But that is something that has been floated. We've seen draft proposals of what that might be. So just putting that out. Yeah.
question. I noticed on some of the intersection treatments that there are roundabout options. The one at Ellensdale and Kings Valley doesn't have that listed. Is there any reason why that wasn't a consideration?
Not off the top of my head. And I won't put you on the spot on this one, Erica, but it's it would need to be a big roundabout. We need to consider the right of way impacts. One thing I'll mention, and Mark, maybe you're about ready to jump in here, is that generally speaking, whenever we're identifying a traffic control change in the ODOT intersection, we are non-specific about what it could be. It's the language could look something like modify the configuration and or traffic control of the intersection, maybe in parentheses, like e.g. a roundabout or traffic signal. And usually we do it that way because it would require a more dedicated look at the intersection operations over a longer period of time and consideration to a variety of potential trade-offs. So much like for Villa, they would more than likely do an intersection control evaluation to determine what that is to improve. So our goal here would really be to identify, is there a deficiency? What is the extent of that deficiency? Can we address it through some alternative measure, street connections, mobility targets, signal optimization, we could play with some of that as well. But if it needs to be something much more significant, then we'll put that in the chat.
Just to validate what Matt just said, the intersection control evaluation is the process that leads to kind of what the treatment would be. So that's where they would say roundabout is more optimal than a signal. At Kings Valley and Ellendale, it really comes down to the footprint. You can see how at those corner roundabouts take a bunch of ground, right? And you have 2 service stations, strip mall. I think never less small from another corner. So it would just be cost prohibitive and really disruptive to the commercial businesses. I mean, it's nice. I'm going to show my own personal preferences here. I prefer the roundabouts because when you have no power, the intersection doesn't get so operative.
So again, a lot of intersection considerations out there. Love to hear back on whether or not these are the ones that we should be thinking about in the future, whether these are the treatments we should be thinking about, and we'll extend the same type of questions and opportunities for feedback to the public during our. All right, so we're going to jump into the pedestrian and bicycle systems. I might need to pick up the pace just a tad on some of this. We're a little bit more than halfway through the presentation, so but keep going here. First off, I'll acknowledge that when you see this memo, you'll see that the ped and bike facility options are extensive. We did our best to consolidate these as much as we can, but there's a lot there. In some instances, it's done on a segment by segment basis, and we're looking at a broad range of treatments. Generally, what we're trying to do is we're trying to either bring it up to some kind of a standard. We're trying to bring it up to like a comfortable level of traffic stress, whether that's pedestrian or bicycle, or we're trying to provide some type of enhanced facility to accommodate a more broad range of different users. So things like, even though curb tight sidewalks is here, Chase, it's an alternative that's out there, and curb tight sidewalks adjacent to parking, bikes, and things like that. It has a place. Sidewalks with planting strips is kind of the direction that a lot of folks are going. Other types of sidewalks with the hardscape strips, more typical of a commercial or downtown type of an area. And then there's a variety of other things like crossings, paths, street furniture, and stuff like that. So when you get to take a look at this, I just wanted to highlight like what this kind of looks like. So in this example, this is just a snapshot of what's on the pedestrian alternatives table. We break it down by roadway segment. roadway and then roadway segment. We talk about the different things that we're considering through here, what the type of existing facility is, what the speeds, what the volumes are, different things like that. And then we go through a range of alternatives. In most instances, we're trying to highlight what those alternatives achieve in terms of level of traffic stress, or what we would be left with. So, for example, from Kings Valley, from Walnut Avenue to Hinkle, we would actually see if we maintained it as it is today, the LCS3. Otherwise, you could do a variety of things. You can stripe it as bike lanes to provide that additional buffer. You could reconstruct the sidewalk landscape strip buffers consistent with some of the ODOT standards. You could install enhanced crossing trails. So we don't have time, unfortunately, to go through every one of these because it's again every facility that we've evaluated to some extent highlights a lot of these things. I think the type of feedback we'd be looking for here is maybe go to the roadways you're most familiar with, the ones that you walk on, identify, look at the types of treatments and the range of treatments we're recommending, or that we're considering, and let us know if we're getting this right. If there's other things we should be considering. If there's if there's a particular treatment really like, there's other ways of providing feedback. I think when we get in front of the public, we're probably going to be asking for them to look at a different range of treatments, and then as well as the locations of those treatments, and this can pinpoint how those two things might. And before I turn you loose on questions, I'll just jump ahead and say the bike facilities we treated very similarly, where we have a broad range of different bike facilities, everything from a shared environment to a separated environment, bike lanes, and buffered bike lanes, or I should say designated, and then the separated environment, separated bike lanes, cycle tracks, things like that. We also have, I talked earlier about complex striping as the approach to the Ellendale Kings Valley intersection. This is a way of enhancing that by providing green stripe, green paint through the middle. And then the last thing there is shown is forward. So for the bike alternatives, we take a very similar approach, segment by segment, and consideration by consideration, provide a broad range of alternatives. Also mentioned here that we do see anything in bold, we'll see that that's consistent with the existing plan improvement, or anything that's in italics. We'll see has that safe routes is recommended in safe routes to school plan. So we're trying to tie together existing planning efforts with all of our recommendations. So you'll see that all that kind of gets folded together into this list of alternatives. I know that's a lot to try to process. Any questions? It doesn't have to be quick. Any questions on that? And maybe even just questions on how we might approach getting feedback on it. Because again, these are lengthy sections for folks. Ben, anybody online?
Jolynn has her hand raised.
Oh,
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Go ahead, Jolynn.
Okay, thank you. So I would just recommend, I know that the memo mentions transit.
You might need to unmute your mic. We're not hearing you come through.
Definitely not muted. Let me try.
I can hear you, but I'm also on Zoom, so it might be the city's end.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I can hear you as well.
Okay.
All right, we can hear you guys now. Go
Can you
ahead.
hear us now? Okay. Okay, great. Thanks. So I would just recommend in some of your examples of the complete streets and pedestrian facilities and bicycles facilities, including examples of how transit stops fit into those. Especially, with the memo considering your local circulator. Just to kind of get that out in front of people early on so that they're thinking about it. Just, the earlier you can get that out in front of people, the better. So that it doesn't, come as like an afterthought, basically. And, Chase, you mentioned how you can kind of encourage some of the development growth by making some zoning changes, but I, we've also found it to be extremely helpful that the city of Salem includes specific transit stop language in their code for street improvements. So I highly recommend adopting something like that as well, especially again, if Dallas is going to consider their own local circulator at some point in the future. It just makes it so much easier when you have new developments coming in and there's a requirement to do a half street improvement or a full street improvement. The language is already in the code. They can see it coming basically, and then they're also held to that standard. So in the past, we would request transit stops to be included on new street developments, either by the city or by a developer. And, they would basically say, thanks for your input, and no transit facilities would be built. But now that it's actually in the code, if we request or if the city wants to see improvements to a transit stop, then, they're required to do so or the developer's required to do so. And it just makes life so much easier. So yeah, I'd like to see in some of the examples how what a complete street with a transit stop might look like, or what some of those pedestrian facilities would look like if there happened to also be a bus stop there, and then how would a bike lane interact with a bus stop when you're looking at the bicycle facilities.
Thank you, Jillian.
Mhm.
And we do have a transit section, but I don't think we get into that level of detail that we were describing. So I know we can certainly improve what we've done so far. All right, Eric, do you mind helping me with this Riverfield Trail updates?
Sure, yeah. So here you can see some locations where there's proposed trail alignments for the TSP. One of these is gonna be along the creek if we continue the trail that way, kind of proposed way, most of the plans that we've seen for this trail itself. And then also there is an on-street connection, option for this. This just shows, will give some connectivity, obviously, to that trail, but also, when you're going downtown, could be more connections to that trail quicker as well. And then we have some on-street connections from Barbary Avenue and Academy Street to this trail as well. So this is focusing a lot on how to get better connections from some of these neighborhoods, maybe some other commercial locations, and get them to that trail. Yes.
So, public transportation alternatives. So we have a handful of things that we've highlighted here. Again, these are trying to present a broad range of potential alternatives. And I won't try to address exactly what Jolie was asking for, but I understand what she's getting at. It certainly be better to hear. But for now, the range includes new and existing route changes. So again, we heard from a lot of folks during our open house and during some of our prior meetings that people are interested in some kind of a local circulator. People are interested in some potential modifications to existing routes and trying to extend that service to different parts of the city. And like as well as accommodating some of the future redevelopment of Lockdale Node and elsewhere. We also heard from folks that are interested in the service schedule and coverages. So again, working with charities to increase the weekend bus service, transit stop improvements. So the city's got a handful of stops here and there. It's kind of gets to like one of the things that Jolene was talking about, taking into consideration what type of facility, where the crossing is, what type of facilities are provided anywhere near the crossings, in different places where we potentially enhancing those. Park and ride locations, so getting some proposed locations on there, the Walmart parking lot, west of the hospital campus. And then I believe that's a church house, its presence in Yeah, that's right. Sorry, our transit counterpart is not with us today to cover some of this stuff, but. And then the last one is first and last mile connectivity, just trying to accommodate some walking and biking improvements. Looking at sidewalk connections, crosswalks, things like that, in and around transit stops. I think this is the last one here, our rail system alternatives. So obviously Dallas has a rail line that comes into the mill site area down there towards the south. And what we're looking at here is a variety of ways that we could be potentially enhancing the existing rail crossings, the upgraded rail crossings. So at some point in the future, if Furville extends down to Monmouth Cough, or we really need to be in crossing there. You know, the old adage, I don't know if this is still how people are thinking about it, was that if you bring in one new crossing, you have to close one or more existing crossings. But nevertheless, if we do extend further to the south, we're going to need to look at ways that can potentially enhance that crossing. Other things that have come up on other similar projects when we're talking about enhancing rail systems is improving ADA compliance at pedestrian crossings at the rail line, also bicycle crossings at the rail line. Working with rail operators to reduce the speeds, potentially reducing the noise pollution and other things into the community. Working with ODOT Rail to consider emergency response. One of the things that we know is that a handful of city's existing emergency response facilities are all on the north side of the rail line. And if there's an emergency on the south side of the rail line, does that become a problem? And then the last thing is passenger rail service between Dallas and Salem. Is there a way that we can activate some type of service? And when we talk about this stuff, a lot of this stuff is contingent on conversations and coordination of plans and policies from others, not necessarily the city. And so a lot of the times this is just our way of saying these are the things we're interested in, these are the things we'd like to try to improve upon. All right. Actually, we do have just a couple more on this memo. Safety alternatives. So safe bus to school should bring in, I mentioned before, both in the pedestrian and the bicycle sections when we talk about a variety of different existing planning efforts related to safe bus to school, wanting to make sure we're bringing in as much of that as necessary to this plan. We've also got a handful of safety alternatives that stemmed from our earlier the safety issues. It's got a number of intersections that had a combination of high crash rates, of a high proportion of specific crash types, a few segments that show similar characteristics. So really just trying to highlight different opportunities for addressing those. So we go through and identify a variety of potential safety enhancements at these locations. And I know I'm kind of zipping through the last few slides here, but this memo, again, this tech memo number 6, it's in very much preliminary stage right now. We will be circulating this to you guys more formally here soon, and we would like to get as much feedback as we can on this. This will be one of the main topics that we cover with our open house. We want to make sure that we get as much feedback as we can. So I'll kind of lightly pose this right now, but for the sake of time, might want to keep things sort of moving along here. But generally what we're looking for, if getting this memo, looking to make sure that the alternatives reflect the appropriate range of solutions. Other things that we should be considering. Are there specific alternatives that should be prioritized or de-emphasized? Any other project ideas, locations, or concerns? So just really wanting to emphasize the draft nature of this memo and wanting to make sure that you guys realize we're still trying to make it very much a Dallas oriented plan. Are there other locations, other treatments that we should be considering?
I would be interested in seeing as an alternative option for the Kings Valley and Ellendale intersection. Adding a traffic signal head for bicycles as a separate phase. You mentioned the conflict zone being like 270 feet long as you approach the intersection. So moving that curved side and then having a separate signal phase for the bikes could be a way to reduce that exposure. With, you know, minimal change to the rest of the intersection. Not that I don't like the idea of a protected intersection, but that's a bigger.
Great. More things like that, so anything else you guys got that you want to see in the plan from us? Alright. I think I'm gonna jump in to transportation funding and finance. And this. Yeah, okay. They are, this isn't right. Okay, so tech memos number 7 is from finance. I guess I have that. Should be. So this is pretty short, unless any of you guys are financial wizards. We took a look at the existing revenues, the existing expenditures, and tried to project into the future to understand how much funding would be available to fund improvements identified in the TSP. So existing revenues covers a broad range of state and local funds, the state highway appropriations, which is essentially the gas tax, some federal reimbursements, system development charges, and a variety of other things, grants, interest, urban. Expenditures, pretty typical stuff. You have your personnel, you have your maintenance and services, capital outlay. So when you combine those two things together and project them out over a 20-year time frame, we do have a positive arc there, which is a good thing. I'll mention real quick in the memo, we look at a few different ways. We look at 3 different scenarios. We look at sort of a very conservative scenario, very not conservative scenario. This one kind of fits there in the middle, where all the funds continue to grow and similar, following historical trends, both on the revenue side and the expenditure side. And so the net increase over that 20-year horizon is about a $17.9 million number. We're still going to be looking at refining that as we're moving forward. But that's essentially the dollar amount that we feel like we're going to be able to work with when we get to the end of the project. So a little less than $1 million a year could potentially be devoted to transportation improvements. So this does not include the some of the capital outlay that we were referring to previously. So the cities, Chase, jump in here if I'm wrong on stuff, but the city's sidewalk improvement program, the city's safety, the safety equipment program, pavement rehabilitation, variety of other things probably leaving out that fall into that sort of capital outlay. So 17.9 million is really what we're seeing as a potential opportunity for funding specific improvements in the space. No, just it's not correct to me. So we have a potential local funding mechanism. So even if 17.9 million isn't enough to cover everything we identified, which likely won't be, we have a tendency to identify a lot of potential projects. There are a variety of things that the city could do. So a couple things that that we looked at here. One, system development charges. Updating the STC methodology, the fee schedule. You guys are already updating on a regular basis. You're making your fees on unit costs of projects. So that's a good thing. You're creating another thing you can do is create a modal specific STC categories. So some jurisdictions you have like a bicycle and pedestrian specific STC in addition to other STCs. Could also be refining the trip generation rates and land use categories. Right now, we have a broad range of potential categories. And as I'm looking at this urban renewal district, I'm realizing that we did not update this subsequent to some of the feedback we got. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to disregard it. So this is the one, I think we took this. So urban renewal, maybe I'd ask Chase or Charlie to jump in on this one, but the urban renewal is it's kind of run its course. Is that right? Probably don't want to carry.
No, it's just that one of the bullets there says expand the boundary. There's a certain limitation on that because we're almost to our statutory limit as to how much of the city can even in with the real district now, so there's very limited ability to expand the district or establish new districts. The other ones I think are out, one or two more, first one, the two middle ones are question.
So again, apologies, I meant to update that before we jumped into the presentation. Other funding mechanisms, a lot of folks are getting, a lot of communities are becoming more and more familiar with something called a transportation utility fee. It could also be a street utility fee. There's a variety of different names for this, but essentially it's a fee for updating and maintaining and enhancing the transportation system. So it's a civic utility. There's also the local fuel tax. Again, a number of jurisdictions have a local fuel tax. Some counties have fuel taxes. It's another way that folks are funding their systems. There's the LIDs or local improvement districts, there's economic improvement districts, and then there's local bond measures. So each has their own potential drawback. Each would require significant amount of outreach and education and approval, going through its own sort of approval process, but each has the potential to add quite a bit of funding for transportation improvement. I should just mention, even though this is kind of an outdated conversation at this point, but the existing funding mechanisms for transportation generally don't keep up. And so a lot of folks usually look for different funding mechanisms, different ways of both maintaining and updating their transportation systems. And so that list of other funding mechanisms is becoming more and more regular in some communities. Kind of a combination of the modal specific STCs, transportation utility fees, and local fuel tax. I think those are probably three most common that we're seeing these days. Local bond measures, I'm not seeing a lot of those just because they tend to compete with other local bond measures for schools and parks and other things like that. But certainly transportation utility fees, I think, we're seeing more and more.
So I'll repeat one of the comments that I had during our project team meetings for the benefit of the group. Obviously, the list of projects that we have is going to be X number of dollars. We have 17.9 million in future revenue with which to pay for that. But some of those costs would also be attributable to developers doing development adjacent to that infrastructure. And so that's the one thing that I'm not really seeing accounted for necessarily in the forecasts here. Is sort of what percentage of cost is something that will be covered by development. Not every project is going to have that kind of developer share, but some of them will, especially new streets, the greenfields. Those are often funded either wholly or in part by developers.
I don't know that it will be reflected in the forecast, but when we're developing, when we have our list of preferred alternatives or preferred projects, essentially, and we're developing cost estimates, and those cost estimates are then chipping away at that $17.9 million figure. We'll want to have a conversation about which of those, like you said, which of those projects are going to be entirely developer driven. So whether that's future street extensions, whether that's frontage improvements, in some instances it could even be some of the off-street type of connections, depending on developers' preferences. So there, certainly want to have that conversation, and I think it'll come later when we're thinking about how much, not just how much money we have available, but how much we can spend.
Thank you.
Great. So this memo is relatively short. Again, love to get your feedback on that. Any specific funding mechanisms you think that would be some of the communities would be more receptive to? Would love to hear about that. Otherwise, concerns, feasibility, practicality, and community support for the funding mechanisms. Are you aware of any other federal programs? I guess I should mention that the memo also includes an appendix with federal and state funding mechanisms included in there as well. Just to highlight a couple real quick. One that's been gaining a lot of popularity with folks is the Oregon Community Paths program that funds pathways and off-street paths and trails. And so there's been a lot of planning and a lot of development with it, not development, but a lot of planning, design, and construction of trail projects and study from this Oregon Community Paths program. There's other state programs, so there are federal programs that potentially fund those programs. And then are there additional local funding tools that the city should prioritize or explore further? So we kind of give you a range, but are there other things that let us know? All right, the last memo. So this one covers a lot of ground too. It's a little bit longer, definitely more oriented towards standards. We're not going to cover all this today in the presentation. Just a couple of things I'll highlight sort of quickly. First one, access management standards. So this is like how many driveways, how many street connections are located along a given roadway, how closely spaced are they? Access spacing has a fairly significant influence over traffic flow along the roadway. It impacts the safety and the traffic stress of pedestrian and bicycle facilities. There's a lot that kind of goes into access spacing and driveway spacing. So really all we're looking to do here is to expand how the city is currently looking at access spacing. Today it's really just focused on intersections, or maybe it's driveways, but we're looking at adding standards for both intersections and driveways and between intersections like driveways. So just sort of expanding that a little bit to think about how those standards all work with one another. We're kind of beefing up the variance process a little bit. So whenever a developer comes in, wants to put in a driveway, but doesn't quite meet those standards, what's that process for meeting the standards? Similarly, a process for consolidation of driveways and access is over time. And then last thing, just addressing spacing on opposite sides of the road. So make sure that these are lining up appropriately or have appropriate separation. So you have to really like development code and standards in order to really appreciate access. Similarly, functional classification changes. We've got a handful of new roadways that are coming in. We want to make sure that those are classified appropriately. We've also got some existing roadways where we're thinking about changing those classifications to better align with the intended form function of those roadways. Functional classification is kind of a big deal. It does determine what the intended form and function of the roadway is, informs the design standards, the type of bike and pet facilities that are provided, and a variety of other things. So when we're making changes to the classifications, it's an important consideration.
Quick question, the access management standards that you showed on the previous slide, do those account for the highway design manual for the city highways?
That's a great question, Mark, and this is these are for city facilities. So the ODOT division 751, I believe. This covers all of ODOT's access spacing standards. It applies both intersections and driveways along state facilities. And any access to a state facility goes through ODOT's process. So yeah, these are specific for this question. I'm going to skip over this one to jump into these guys. So I'm going to go backwards. This shows the functional classification and potential changes, including things like major and minor arterials, major and minor reflectors, and so on. This starts to show how we're thinking about reconfiguring the roadway. So the one on the top left, so the left side are the major collectors, the right side are the minor, major arterials, right side of the minor arterials. And this we've almost come full circle to the Mark's comment earlier, where today the major arterial cross section shows 2 lanes in both directions with a center to it turn. The major difference between what you have today and what we're providing here is a reallocation of the space between the curves. We're looking at shifting some of the space of the travel lanes from 12 feet down to 11 feet, of the center turn lane from 14 feet down to 12 feet. And we're looking at providing additional buffer and buffer width between the travel lanes and the bike lanes. So this is pretty typical these days of making that transition from 12 feet down to 11 feet. And again, pretty typical of having something like a buffered bike lanes on a facility like this. The one right below represents another modification to that cross section. In this instance, we're actually shifting the bike facility behind the landscape strip adjacent to the sidewalk. So this creates a sort of a separated bike facility, kind of gets back to some of the conversation we had about level of traffic stress. We're seeing a lot of jurisdictions go this route. It provides a narrower paved surface that requires less maintenance, less pavement preservation, separates the bicycle and pedestrian movements by moving them back behind the curb and potentially behind the landscaping. Still creates designated space for people biking, walking. We're seeing these across the state, in just about every jurisdiction. So you'll see both for the major arterial and for the minor arterial, we're kind of taking a similar approach of reallocating that space, the modified cross section, and reconfiguring that space with shifting the bike lanes behind the landscaping on the other arterial there. Yeah, let's jump in. Let's jump in on the.
You more of this.
Yeah.
So if you go back a slide to the map, you can see that the major arterial classification applies to East Ellendale. Full disclosure, East Ellendale, east of Kings Valley Freeway is designated as a freight route. And we have this construct of PODOT called the Mobility Advisory Committee that is made up of freight interests. And they kind of get the thumbs up and thumbs down on these cross sections and really have not been favorable towards 11-foot travel lanes, so looking for 12 feet. So just word of caution on some of the limitations I'm discussing.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mark. And one thing I'll mention is that we do, so when you get into this memo and you start to look at the cross sections, we have a table, and below the table are many footnotes. And one of those footnotes is that when you're on a freight route, when you're on a high priority transit route, when you're on potentially, I'll get to this in a moment, an evacuation route, those should all those things should be factored into what your travel width is. Generally, we like to see a little bit wider of travel lanes on any one of those routes. So it could be an argument for jumping down to the reconfigured cross section where you kind of see between the one on the top, you have these 11-foot travel lanes here, one on the bottom, you have 12-foot travel lanes, and that's because up here, we have this bike lane with this buffer. Down here, we want to have a little bit of extra space up against, so we like to have at least about a foot shy up against the curb. Sorry, a foot of additional distance when you're curb tight. So we try to use those tables, but cross sections, the tables and the footnotes to really characterize those. That being said, Chase, I want to acknowledge one of your comments about some of these things are so important that you don't want them to get lost in the footnotes. Things like the width of the sidewalk for commercial spaces, the need for creating greater separation or bikes and peds on some of these higher classification and higher speed, higher roadways, and all these other considerations. So I'm definitely open to how we want feedback on how we want to characterize that stuff. How we want to kind of bring those to folks' attention as they're looking through this. Because the cross sections, we want them to both present a standard that the city can lean on, provide enough, but also provide enough flexibility that we can, not so much flexibility that developers and others are going to try to get away with everything, but enough flexibility that you can adapt segment to segment, street to street, based on the needs. of that street. So trying to accomplish a lot with each of these. Mark, I thought you were actually gonna talk about the 5-lane cross section.
Well, I kind of covered that
Yeah.
earlier, and in greater detail than this really merits, however. I just wanted to shine some light on some of the significant challenges that we have with ODOT facilities in Dallas. Just wanted to achieve in our guidance. And these are these are the hard administrative rules that everybody, including cities, adhere to. That's our legal cover for what we do. And all of these standards are in the administrative rule. It's in division something. So just wanted to make sure that we all kind of understand, yes, what we're talking under at a land level. And planning is by nature aspirational. Remember, we also have to ground ourselves in.
That's very important to think about. When you look at this map again, you see that we have Kings Valley, East Ellendale, Monmouth Cutoff, and I always forget the name of this, Fairview. Sure. As major arterials. And so imagine a future where those have 5-lane cross sections. 100 feet of right of way to accommodate that traffic. So the city does have an alternative cross section for the major arterial that is just looks very much like the minor arterial. It's essentially a 3-lane cross section, but it's I don't know what the criteria is, Chase, if there is a criteria to determine the 5 versus the 3. But that's essentially what we're looking at. Some of the other ones like West Ellendale, Miller, Luglo, Turvilla, these would fall more into that minor arterial with a 3-lane cross section. And yeah. So it's definitely something to think about. One of the other things is if we want to do away with the 5-lane cross section, then this major arterial would then look an awful lot like the minor arterial, and maybe redundant to have major and minor arterials. Some jurisdictions have moved away from major and minor arterials. Put Eric on the spot. I don't think the county has moved away from major. Yeah, I'm pretty sure the county still has major and minor arterial, major and minor collector. And so it's something to think about, because as you transition in the city between city and county, to have some consistency there is important. But and then major collector, very similar, looking at reconfiguring or modifying the existing cross section and then reconfiguring the cross section. And then when you jump all the way down to minor collector, this is where you start to see like some variation in the types of facilities. So minor collectors have a tendency to have more on-street parking, still want to have designated bicycle facilities and similar facilities beyond that, landscaping, sidewalks, whatnot. The last couple here, we have a few local street cross sections, and Jason, I forget which one you commented on. Could be this 60-footer right here, where we've got parking on both sides, about a 20-foot travel way, effectively 10 feet both directions, versus this one parking on one side, effectively a 22-foot travel way, parking on one side. Remember, you had a comment about.
So our current standard is a 50-foot right of way. We have an alternative for a 60-foot in high intensity travel areas. So high density residential areas, commercial areas, we have the option for a 60-foot. Not saying that that's wrong necessarily, but just be prepared to justify why that increase is warranted to go to that as a standard. Because right now our current curb to curb width standard is 30-foot curb to curb and a 50-foot right of way. And that doesn't necessarily always leave space for like your Green Street kind of treatments. So to the extent that those may be more required in the future, having more space on the side for that could be a justification for these kinds of things, but.
Okay. And I guess there is a third. There's a third local street cross section. It's one that doesn't have any on-street parking, as a relatively narrow. I think it's about a 20-foot travel way as well. It's just unfortunately not shown here right now. So I don't know in this instance whether or not we're looking to identify one as the standard. It's, and some jurisdictions have, like, they will distinguish within their functional classification between, maybe there'll be like a neighborhood route, or residential 1, 2, and 3, or some other variation of that. And if we wanted to go there, we certainly could go there, and we wanted to just continue having the flexibility to select the preferred local street cross section. Kind of on a case by case basis, so there isn't necessarily a preferred, but sort of a range. Which I think that's what we tried to get to in the memo, is more show one cross section, and then within the tables, show the range of potential alternatives. The challenge with that is I think like you're saying, is that we don't want to present a 60-foot, well, maybe it would be like a 50 to 60-foot cross section. I think we might need to get into this on how to show, if we want to show one with a range. All right. So this kind of falls into other elements, and we're kind of on the home stretch now here, but we have been trying to cover again quite a bit of ground here. We've got local evacuation routes. So the county has an evacuation plan. The plan more or less says we want to try to emphasize major facilities, designated local routes for evacuation, both on primary evacuation routes, alternative evacuation routes. We took a stab at these, shared them with the county, got their preliminary feedback in general. They were supportive, but I want to hear from folks again whether this feels right. You look at kind of the broad picture of Dallas, where it falls, what type of emergencies you might run into, what type of scenarios might result in evacuation. What do you think about which direction you're probably going to be headed? More than likely, it's going to be to the north and to the east. And so I'm trying to build on that and emphasize where those routes go. I really see this as something that lives in TSP, but maybe influences what type of cross sections, standards, lane widths, things like that get applied as you go forward. Very similarly, freight routes. Mark mentioned this before, but that segment of East Allendale, east of King Valley, is it's a reduction review route, which means that it's the map. So I'm stumbling over what MAC stands for.
Mobility advisory.
Mobility advisory. Like to take a close look at whatever changes we're recommending on one of these routes, particularly don't want us to go any narrower. The rest of the routes that are shown there are local routes. It's more or less codified in the code about how freight enters and exits the city. So these are the routes that are reflected there. Again, really factors into how the street is designed. Other things, actually, I guess I'm kind of jumping down here to the bottom. The last thing, the rubber tire trolley service. So this was an idea that was floated, like maybe to offer as an alternative to or in support of existing transit services. Maybe in consideration to some other local jurisdictions that have established these. I've seen some success in these. These are literally just our brainchildren of just using markers and highlighting on the map where we think potential rubber tire trolley services are located. The alternatives that we've got here, we've got ones that sort of emphasizes jobs and households, one that's more focused on jobs and it's more focused on households. So trying to capture as much as we can. Tends to be focused there on the east more than the west, but this is again just sort of an idea that and I think that's it. The things that I left out, we do talk a fair amount about enhanced pedestrian crossings. That one of the exercises that we're hoping to do as part of the open house is to present folks with a variety of different enhanced crossing treatments. Provide them with a map and ask them to pinpoint where they feel like these treatments are needed. Pedestrian access ways, this is really just how do we make sure that we're developing maybe a less than connected network. We're still providing some accessibility for pedestrians. Things like site plan review I think we identify a variety of ways the city can enhance their review of traffic impact studies and other things to try to like reemphasize some of the goals, objectives, policies that are presented here. And I kind of talked already about certain mobility standards. Probably lose my voice here. TDM and TSM, transportation demand management, transportation system management, these are just ways that they're eking out a little bit more efficiency out of the existing system. So try to again cover a lot of ground on this memo. Some of it's more theoretical than others, but just different ideas. Broad feedback we're looking for is do these standards, specifications align? This is probably the most important part of this memo. If I could focus your attention and really that roadway classifications and cross sections. I'd love to get your feedback on those things. Some of the freight route, the stuff that we presented here in the presentation, the evacuation routes, the freight routes. What are the real pinch points, the constraints, the things that we should be considering? What can make the plan more Dallas focused? And then street types, locations, context, where cities should adjust those cross sections. Any other considerations that should go into that kind of decision making. And then other standards, guidance areas you feel should be included. See a type of it. I think that's it. I'll circle back real quick and just say we're looking for comments by Wednesday, December 3rd. So that's just a couple of weeks from today, I believe. With that timeline, even though I don't want to extend it, that timeline can extend if need be, because we're planning on having an open house into early part of January. But I would love to get your feedback in advance so that we can incorporate all that feedback into the materials put out for the public. So if there's anything that's really critical that feels like it needs to be addressed before we go out to the public and say, hey, here's what we're thinking about doing, let us know as soon as within the next 2 weeks. Other feedback come at the open house, at the online open house, which we're planning right now for the early March. And then our next meeting, we're shooting for March 25th, 2026. Really what we'll be doing is we'll be revisiting some of what we talked about today and what we heard from open house number 2. We'll be presenting the last 2 tech memos and initial input on recommendations of the TSP. I'm trying to visualize the timeline. Do we have the TSP at that stage or are we looking more kind of high level at the TSP? So more to come on that, but we'll be getting about that. And that's it. Yeah, 1 minute. Just a little bit of this. And then
that pace change.
any I know we just hit 6 o'clock right then. Any kind of closing thoughts, considerations? I know we didn't save a ton of time to chat. One of the
And isn't all of this just gonna be obsolete once the teleporters are deployed?
teleporters, flying cars.
We'll find different jobs now.
They'll need you even more.
Yeah. Possible. At least freight, right? Freight is still.
I mean, how do you manage the conflict, because now you have a 3-dimensional space.
Yeah, there's, there are other, some of those big picture planning things like automated or autonomous vehicles, driverless vehicles, like electrification. There's a broad range of transportation issues that could significantly influence infrastructure over the next few years.
So, one important piece of transportation that is not anywhere in this, because it's not actually in motion, is parking. So I don't know if there's any language that you want to have around parking, either for cars or bicycles. But that is in many ways an important component of transportation. People generally don't drive cars if there's no place to park them, and unfortunately bicycles, same thing.
I think that would be good points to talk about transportation management. Because, you know, for particularly if you're looking at mixed use centers, policies or even ordinance, provisions that only provide for one parking space per dwelling unit, that can really reduce the, you know, the pressure on the transportation system.
And there may also be space for, transit signal priorities, the buses get through the traffic signals faster, or, real-time arrival display screens at bus stops. So some of those intelligent transportation system concepts.
Some of those, so certainly. Some of those are certainly being addressed, and parking is loosely addressed in TDEP. I think we refer to the potential for parking management as a way of reducing demand on the system. But it's fair to say that parking can sometimes be addressed in the TSP. And I think maybe you mentioned we have a downtown parking well or complete. And so, yeah, it's something that does come up in the TSPs from time to time. People get really passionate about parks. Particularly when you talk about modifying parking minimums for multifamily residential developments, things like that. As long as you're preserving enough to keep folks happy, that those things are hot issues. Certainly bring people out to our open houses.
Talk about on-street parking.
And then there's on-street parking. We do touch on the potential. So I didn't mention this today, but it's for the extended portion of the meeting. There will be places in the network where people are currently parking on street, and that on-street parking will at some point need to transition into a bus. And I'll just pick on the street there. Okay. I think they're like. How about I was thinking ankle. Ankle would be different too. I was thinking about that. What's this? Lock Reel, the one that goes down by the school.
Yeah.
But quite excited. There's on-street parking on both sides of it. It is a collector. I'm not sure. And my brain is fuzzy at this point. Spent everything I had in these 2 hours. It should transition at some point into a facility that accommodates bike lanes on both sides. So what we usually see some jurisdictions do is build into the code or into their design standards consideration to a transition from on-street parking to bike lanes when you see about 2,500 to 3,000 vehicles. Some of these facilities are already there. Some of these facilities will be there in the next 20 years. Lock Reel is a perfect example of that. Hankel is another example like that. And that is a tough transition to make because folks have grown accustomed to parking on the street in front of the house. I'm not realizing that that is actually should be a designated bike facility based on these things. So it's a very common thing to talk. And there are ways to sort of make that transition smoother than not. I think we observed maybe a small handful of cars on Lock Reel last time we were out there. I think there are big chunks of it where they restrict on-street parking, maybe for buses into the school.
Maybe on the west side.
Yeah. Anyway, there are other streets like that, same situation. So making that transition is difficult, but it's a natural progression. Streets.
So I think something that would be helpful is if you could enumerate specific criteria for when that happens. That way, when the time comes to actually make that change, city council, the higher ups don't have to weigh in on it, because they've already approved the master plan that says, when you reach this threshold, this is what you do. So that's something that I would.
I think where I've seen it most effective is baked into the design standards and in code. And that way like you say, when that transition occurs, it's already, this decision is already made. There are some ways of easing that transition, and I've seen some jurisdictions sort of maintain on-street parking on one side and try to preserve bike lane, or try to preserve on-street parking on one side, still provide bike lanes on both sides. Narrowing up the cross sections and things, and Montreal should be a good example of where that could work. It's a little bit trickier, just depending on what type of facility you want. You want both bike lane versus the parking lane. But yeah, we can certainly do something like that. As for the rest of it, I don't currently anticipate getting into the parking standards, like the minimums, maximums, and things like that. We will be, when we get to implementing ordinances, that's usually when we open up the code and start taking a closer look at what the code looks like. And if that's an area you want us to focus on, then let's make sure we chat about that. So that'll be the next set of those. Anything else? Any fans of on-street parking? You have enough parking downtown?
Yeah, much. Jump on the road.
Ben, anything online?
Looks like we're good.
Well, thanks, everybody. We made it all the way through, a great meeting, and again, provide feedback within a couple of weeks. I'm definitely hitting on that critical feedback. I'm happy to extend that timeline into December, January timeframe. Love to see it at the open house. We will be more formally announcing when that will occur once we kind of get our heads together and wrapped around that timeframe. And love to again see you guys and help you get your help getting the word out on that as well. So, thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
No,